Good morning. Today is April 13th, and my topic for the day is Israel. As you know, things are changing from hour to hour in the Middle East, so I'm going to address some things which are not minute-to-minute policy changes. Before I start, let me call your attention to the fact that in the middle of the night, or was it early morning, Trump put on an AI-generated view of himself as Jesus Christ in response to the Pope's criticism of the war. Trump has been railing against the Pope, and of course the Pope's role in the world is to advocate for peace. But anyway, it's an amazing photograph or picture, AI generated. I gather that Trump just took it off, but I'm sure it's all over the media. So my first discussion about Israel has to do with how did we get into this war with Iran in the first place? And it is the case that Netanyahu has been advocating that the US should join and attack Iran. Iran, of course, having been a sore spot for Israel since it has supported Hezbollah in Lebanon and other outfits against Israel over the years. So Netanyahu is anxious that the United States join in attacking Iran. He was not successful in convincing, for example, the previous two presidents, not including him, of course. And he has been successful in recruiting Trump to join in an attack on Iran. So what got us into this war with Iran, there have been other American difficulties and conflicts and so forth with Iran, was that Netanyahu finally managed to convince an American president, after failing with 2 or 3 previous American presidents, that the time had come to have a war with Iran. And of course, Netanyahu knew that in spite of the various military capacities and strength, that he needed the United States if a serious assault on Iran was to take place. So the fact that this war is going on was the fact that Netanyahu finally convinced Trump and his administration to go ahead. Then there is the military side of it. Iran, of course, is a very strong military power on its own and has defensive capabilities and so on, so that Netanyahu probably thought that the Iron Dome that covers Iran and its military capacity would suffice to safeguard Israel in such a war. You probably have read over time that missiles from Iran and so forth have actually gotten through the Iron Dome, and that there have been deaths, bombings and deaths in Israel, but they have been fairly limited. So Trump and Netanyahu got into bed with each other to attack Iran. We now have monumental mess all over the Middle East as a consequence of this. And in the meantime, the negotiations, for example, that just took place in Pakistan with the Iranians did not include the Israelis. And Israel has been very busy doing something else, namely attacking Lebanon, which is also an old sore and is an area of multiple attacks. Now, Hezbollah in Lebanon has been supported financially and otherwise by Iran, right? So they're viewed by Israel as sort of surrogates. But Hezbollah has been attacked in Lebanon at various other times, but obviously Netanyahu thought the time was ripe to really give it to Lebanon, or as the case may be, Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the first thing that that Israel did was to invade the lower portion of Lebanon, and about 1 million people were told to leave that part of southern Lebanon. More recently, it has been said that Israel would continue to run that part of Lebanon up to the Lahani River, and that these 1 million people who were ousted can't come back, shouldn't come back, and Israel will run it. So now you have a separate conflict that has been started again with Lebanon. And while it is the case that Israel says they're hunting down the remnants of Hezbollah having been attacked previously, has had large losses in leadership and in supporters. But this time they're going to wipe them out. And in recent days, Israel has not just attacked that bottom area of Lebanon, which it says it's going to control, but also has attacked Beirut. Now, Beirut is a urban area, and what is happening in Beirut right now is not dissimilar to, in some ways, of what's happened in Gaza, which is the Israelis learned through intelligence that a Hezbollah person, let's say, lives in a 10-story apartment building, 7-story apartment building. And in order to get that particular person, they bomb the entire apartment building, which means civilians who are not in any way involved, who may not be part of Hezbollah at all, also lose their lives or become refugees. So the situation in Lebanon at the moment is dire, and Israel is to some extent concentrating on Lebanon. And it's a serious war. And as is the case in Lebanon and elsewhere, the Israeli military, is very good. It's very well armed. It has a lot of technology. And as Americans, it's useful to recall that ever since the beginning of Israel in 1948, the largest proportion of U.S. military aid has always gone to Israel. So much of Israel's military hardware, planes, and so forth, are in fact the consequence of sustained military assistance by the United States to Israel, not to diminish Israel's own technological and military capacity, but certainly their ability to do harm in neighboring countries that they perceive to be their enemies, or infiltrated by Iranian related groups. The U.S. is to some extent complicit in all of that. Now, the Israelis actually have a slogan or a couple of words to express their repeated mowing down of Hezbollah, but also non-Hezbollah Lebanese infrastructure, civilian buildings, and so forth. And that is called mowing the grass. Israel has had a policy for some years of knowing that it's surrounded by actual and potential enemies. And the way it seeks to deal with them is periodically to attack them, to decimate their leadership, infrastructure, and so forth, which then, according to Israeli policy, gives them a window of, let's say, 5 years, 10 years, and so forth, when they're not maligned, attacked in any way, or feel insecure by opposition groups, Israeli opposition groups in those countries, opposition to Israel. So mowing the grass is currently going on by Israel, not unrelated, but different from the Israeli support of American military actions in the middle in Iran. So you have sort of two streams of activity. On the one hand, Netanyahu having encouraged and eventually found that Trump and his administration was willing to go to war with Iran, and Israel certainly has participated, but Israel is also following its own agenda of enemies, quote unquote, in other parts of its own area, and at the moment, Lebanon. Now, let me go back in history a little bit and say that the idea of Israel, the founding of Israel, was talked about seriously in something called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when the English, when it was still colonialism, Ottoman Empire rules, and so forth, said that the Israel should come into being, that is to say, a Jewish state. Now, then you had World War II, you had the Holocaust and all the rest. Not surprisingly, the idea of developing or giving a state, namely Israel, to Jews who suffered during the Holocaust, also discriminated against in North Africa and other places. So in 1948, the State of Israel was founded. Now, Israel, where the State of Israel is located, was not an empty desert. People lived there, and the people who lived there were Palestinians. And Palestinians and Jews, this is the best way to put it before Israel was a state, had been living in the area that is now Israel and the West Bank and some adjacent areas for centuries, in and out, here and there, and so forth. So if you've ever been to Israel, you know that there are ancient monuments that are Palestinian, and there are ancient monuments that are Israeli, and of course also Christian. So the histories over centuries certainly has had Israelis and Palestinians in that area. However, when the State of Israel was founded in 1948, the Palestinians were supposed to leave, right? It was now no longer Palestinian. Now, the way this all, and I'm making big generalizations here, the way this all washed out, that about 2 million Palestinians continued, maybe you could say maybe 1.5, you can argue about it, Palestinians continued to live in the State of Israel itself, and they are Palestinian Israelis. They have Israeli citizenship. They were badly discriminated over the years. Their situation has improved somewhat in recent years. If for no other reason that groups of Israelis trying to concern themselves with what's happened to the Palestinians have organized Israeli-Palestinian Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Israelis committees and organizations trying to make the life of the Palestinians, which have certainly been inferior in the State of Israel for many decades, to make their lives more tolerable, to make their education better, to integrate them into advanced education, and so forth. The rest of the Palestinians who lived in the West, who went to the West Bank and also Gaza, we know something about in terms of recent history. And there, let me just bring you a little bit up to date. Uh, Israel has something called the Yellow Line in Gaza, which is about 60% of the landmass in Gaza, which it still rules. And now during the ceasefire, the other 40% is where the remaining Palestinians, Gazans live. As you also know, that 80% or so of all buildings, hospitals, schools, and so forth were destroyed in the Israeli war with Hamas. And so the Gazans now are still living largely in tents without, proper schools, hospitals, and all the rest of it. So the situation there is still a nightmare. And in recent weeks, because of the war with Iran, relatively little attention has been paid and little has been said that what the situation is right now in Gaza. While this is all going on, the situation in the West Bank has also gotten worse. That is to say, the settler population who's are Jewish settlers, right? Orthodox, very often and mostly, have had, their settlements. Then there was the Palestinian area, and many of the Palestinians in the West Bank were also refugees from Israel and other parts of the world, but many of them really have roots that go back centuries. And the Palestinians in the West Bank, among other things, the non-urban ones, often live in villages, run olive groves, etc. Sometimes these olive groves have been in the family for a very long time. And, the idea was that at some point there would be a two-state solution, that is to say, Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank would become a Palestinian state. That was called the two-state solution. That has pretty much gone out of the window in the last few months while we weren't looking, because the settlers have decided to expand their territory and are running over the areas and cleaning out villages, quote unquote, that have been in Palestinian hands, as I said, sometimes for generations. And in the process of everybody being focused on Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran, what you have is an ongoing erosion of villages and land management and so forth by the Palestinians. Some of these villagers, when the settlers move in and start attacking them, return the attacks. That is to say, they try to defend themselves. And as a consequence, of course, some people get killed. So the right wing of Netanyahu's government has just passed a law that any Palestinian in the West Bank who winds up killing an Israeli or a settler will be automatically hanged without trial, which seems a little archaic. In any event, the situation in the West Bank is getting worse as we speak, but for whom? For the Palestinians. And many observers now believe that a two-state solution is dead, because by the time things settle down with Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, and so forth, there will be very little left of the West Bank that could actually become the basis of a Palestinian state. So while we haven't been looking very carefully, the idea of a two-state solution is probably dying, if not dead, as we speak. So while all of this focus has been on Iran and the conflict in Iran and the participation of Israel in the Iran conflict, that is to say, it is also, of course, bombing and so forth in Iran, the situation in the Middle East, the settling down of eventually developing a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, making some kind of accommodation and peace with Lebanon, which is mostly in and of itself anti-Hezbollah, and that the terrain that Israel will now govern in Lebanon takes a chunk off of Lebanon. You see a monumental mess and change in the area that is Israeli politics, in some ways unrelated to the war in Iran, and allowing the Israelis pretty much free, access to and doing pretty much what they want to do in the neighboring area, and making it very impossible for the Middle East post, let's say, Iran getting settled at some point. The situation in Israel, West Bank, Lebanon, Gaza has been altered in such a way that it's difficult to see what the long-term solution will be. I want to slightly switch to a slightly different topic, and that is one wants to think well of the state of Israel and why it was set up, and the fact that it's, is in a bad neighborhood and all the rest of it. But one of the casualties of all of this is international law. International law was developed starting in 18-something, but much of the humanitarian international law, genocide, setting up of the international court, and all of that is really post-World War II, and to some extent is even later, that is to say in the 50s and 60s, in order to never again have the kind of situation that you had in World War II in Europe and in other conflicts, right? And I think Americans in particular, we the citizens, jollied ourselves into believing that most countries find it advantageous to adhere to many of the basics of international law having to do with human rights, of UN, international court, the protection of individuals, and the condemnation and even reckoning of those heads of state and others who violate international law. You might recall that Pinochet, the general who ran Chile for some years and violated international human rights and legal norms, was in fact going to be tried after he stepped down. Turns out he was not, and he died, and all the rest of it. But and certainly after the Yugoslav conflicts, there were Milosevic was hauled in front of the International Court. So there was the beginnings of a sense that if you seriously violated the human rights laws that were put into place in order to protect humans and citizens and call people to account who violated the very complex and difficult to have developed international law having to do with genocide, having to do with human rights, and so forth. There was certainly the beginnings of some feeling that many countries would adhere to this. And of course, what's sort of both sad and shocking is that Israel, which would have had every reason to believe that the human rights, the laws of war, and so forth that came into being after the Second World War in particular, given what happened in Europe, given what happened to Jews and all the rest, would be high on their priority list of something that they wanted to honor and adhere to. And what is both sad and shocking is that Israel is now, as we speak, one of the dominant violators of all these laws and all these rights having to do with Gaza, increasingly having to do with West Bank, Lebanon. It is both shocking, I think, and sad that the country that, in a sense, was victimized by so many violations against human beings and had such a difficult time in the world, that the citizens of that country now are the ones that are violating international law, human rights of every imaginable kind. And it will be, down the road, there will be no doubt international courts over Gaza and so forth. But if you think about it, you would think that Israel would be a country that would want to honor many of the international norms and laws that went into effect or were generated in part because of what happened in World War II and what happened in discrimination in Jews. So the role of Israel, while welcomed by the Trump administration with respect to Iran, and Iran certainly is a difficult and actor, and has lots to answer for it in and of itself, both for its own population and for its role in the world, one would have thought that one of the things that one could count on in Israel is not the sort of human devastation that has happened in Gaza, is happening now in Lebanon, is happening in the West Bank. And I guess one could end by saying that in some senses, Netanyahu and his administration is a policy of mowing the grass now and then means that certainly the Netanyahu and his right-wing government, which morality, ethical standards, adhering to international law, is not a high priority for them. That mowing the grass is exactly how they think about it. They don't think they're in a bad neighborhood, and now and then you just have to kill people. And if you kill lots of children, lots of civilians, take away the olive groves of people who've lived there for a century in the West Bank, well, that's just too bad. And so I think with all the horrible stuff that's going on, I think sometimes it's worth focusing on how it is that a people in a country, Israel, can itself, because of its circumstances, being in an alien terrain, stoop so low and be a major contributor of the laws and norms that were put in place in part to never repeat what happened to Jews in Europe. I think anger is not the right response. I think deep sadness about the failings of humans who can't remember their own history, value their own lives, but not the lives of others. Here I'm talking about, 100,000 Gazan civilians, not at all Hamas people killed. A third or a quarter of all the people killed in Gaza are children and so forth. The ruthlessness of it all is anger producing, but I think is deeply sad. And I think the stain of all of this will not easily go away, even if eventually the Iranian situation gets sorted out. Thank you very much. See you in 2 weeks.